Deep in the ancient hollows of Appalachia, where morning mist clings to mountainsides like spirits reluctant to leave, there exist bloodlines whose very names cause old-timers to lower their voices and glance toward the tree line. These aren't the feuding families you learned about in school textbooks. These are the clans who made bargains in places where shadows fall wrong, who practiced rituals so dark that even federal investigators sealed their reports and walked away without filing charges. 6 families, 6 bloodlines, 6 secrets that the mountains have kept buried for over a century until now. What you're about to discover isn't folklore. It isn't campfire stories meant to frighten children. These are documented accounts of Appalachian families who turned to practices so forbidden that their very existence challenges everything we thought we knew about American history. The evidence has been hidden in sealed court records, abandoned mining reports, and the testimonies of those brave enough to speak before disappearing into the wilderness forever. The mountain people have always understood something that outsiders refuse to acknowledge. In those ancient peaks, where civilization's grip grows thin and the old ways never truly died, help comes from sources that demand payment in blood. And once you make that first offering, once you taste the power that flows from practices older than Christianity itself, there's no walking away from what you've become. Tonight, we're venturing into territories that mapmakers still leave blank. We're uncovering bloodlines that shaped entire regions through terror and supernatural influence. We're revealing families whose descendants still gather in hidden clearings, still honor agreements made with entities that should not exist, still practice rituals that would make seasoned investigators resign rather than document what they witnessed. The Appalachian Mountains hold their secrets close, but tonight those secrets are coming to light. Before European settlers ever set foot in these ancient peaks, the Cherokee spoke of places where the boundary between worlds grew thin, specific valleys where the dead walked freely, where strange lights danced between the trees, where voices called out in languages that predated human speech. They marked these locations as forbidden ground, places where even the bravest warriors would not venture after sundown. But desperate people do desperate things. When the first wave of settlers pushed into these remote hollows, fleeing poverty, persecution, and debt, they found themselves isolated from law, from churches, from the civilizing influence of established communities. In that isolation, when winter threatened to claim their children and starvation knocked at their cabin doors, some families discovered that the Cherokee warnings weren't superstition. They were survival instructions. The families we're about to discuss didn't start as practitioners of dark rituals. They began as ordinary people pushed beyond ordinary limits. But in the deepest hollows of Appalachia, where help from the outside world never came, they learned that other forms of assistance were available. Ancient forms, hungry forms, forms that demanded prices no decent person should ever pay. What transformed these families from struggling pioneers into something far more sinister was their willingness to cross lines that others wouldn't dare approach. They ventured into caves that local legends said led to other worlds. They made offerings at stone circles that seemed to predate human habitation. They spoke words in languages they didn't understand, following instructions that came to them in dreams filled with impossible visions. The power they gained was real, Their crops flourished during droughts that devastated neighboring farms. Their livestock thrived while disease claimed animals for miles around. Their children survived illnesses that killed entire families in nearby settlements. But this prosperity came with changes that neighbors noticed but never mentioned aloud. The children born to these families were different. They moved through the forest without disturbing a single leaf, and they could see clearly in absolute darkness. They spoke to animals that seemed to understand and obey. Most disturbing of all, they aged differently, some appearing far older than their years, others maintaining an unsettling youthfulness that defied natural law. As generations passed, these families developed their own customs, their own laws, their own understanding of what was permissible and what was required. They became kingdoms unto themselves, ruling territories that existed outside the reach of county sheriffs and federal marshals. Their influence spread through bloodlines that intermarried according to patterns that outsiders couldn't comprehend, creating networks of power that controlled entire regions through methods that defied rational explanation. Local authorities learned to avoid certain areas. State investigators found their reports mysteriously classified or lost. Federal agents discovered that some cases were simply too dangerous to pursue. The families had become something beyond law enforcement's ability to handle, protected by forces that turned evidence to ash and witnesses to silence. But the true horror wasn't just in what these families had become. It was in how they maintained their power across generations, passing down not just knowledge, but actual spiritual obligations to children who had no choice but to honor agreements made by ancestors they'd never met. Each new generation found themselves bound by blood to continue practices that grew more elaborate and demanding with each passing decade. The rituals evolved, becoming more complex as the families learned to harness power that shouldn't exist in our world. What began as simple offerings of food and tobacco transformed into ceremonies that required specific dates, precise locations, and sacrifices that pushed the boundaries of human decency. The families became servants to forces they thought they were controlling, trapped in cycles of appeasement that demanded ever greater prices. By the time the 20th century arrived, these bloodlines had created their own hidden culture within American society. They operated businesses that served as fronts for activities that would horrify decent people. They held positions of influence in local governments, ensuring that investigations never proceeded too far. They maintained genealogical records that read like instruction manuals for maintaining supernatural contracts across generations. The 6 families we're about to explore represent the most documented cases of organized ritual practice in American history. Their stories have been pieced together from sources that most historians refuse to acknowledge, testimonies that most investigators dismiss as folklore, and evidence that most authorities prefer to keep sealed. But the truth has a way of surfacing, especially when that truth involves bloodlines that are still active today. These families didn't disappear with the coming of modern times. They adapted, they evolved, they found new ways to honor old agreements while maintaining facades of respectability that fooled everyone except those who knew what signs to look for. The power they gained through generations of ritual practice didn't diminish with the arrival of electricity and automobiles. If anything, it grew stronger as they learned to blend ancient practices with modern methods. Tonight, you'll discover how these families shaped entire regions of Appalachia through influence that went far beyond political or economic power. You'll learn about agreements that bound bloodlines to obligations that transcended death itself. You'll understand why certain areas of these mountains remain deliberately uninhabited, why certain names still cause old-timers to cross themselves and change the subject. Most importantly, you'll realize that the forces these families awakened never went back to sleep. They're still there, still waiting in the misty hollows and forgotten caves, still honoring contracts that were signed in blood by people who thought they were making temporary deals for temporary relief. The mountains remember everything. The darkness preserves what should be forgotten. And somewhere in those ancient peaks where cell phone signals die and GPS devices spin uselessly, the descendants of these 6 families continue to gather on certain nights, continuing practices that their ancestors began over a century ago. What follows is the true history of American darkness, the story of how desperation and isolation created bloodlines that transformed themselves into something that should never have existed. These are the families who proved that in the deepest parts of our country, where civilization's light grows dim, other forms of power are always available to those desperate enough to pay the price. The first family we'll examine made their bargain in the depths of a mountain that local legend said was forbidden ground. They emerged from that darkness changed forever, carrying with them the knowledge that would damn their bloodline for generations to come. Their story begins in the winter of 1887, when desperation drove them into places where the shadows moved wrong and the air tasted like copper. But that's only the beginning. What they discovered in those depths, what they brought back to the surface, and what they passed down to their children represents just the first chapter in a legacy of darkness that continues to this day. The mountain people have always known that some hungers are older than humanity itself. Tonight, you'll learn what happens when ordinary families choose to feed those hungers, and how that choice echoes through bloodlines that can never escape what their ancestors unleashed. These mountains have witnessed things that would make the devil himself turn away in horror. In the deepest hollows of Appalachia, where the mist clings to ancient stone like the breath of something long dead, certain families discovered that survival demanded more than just courage and determination. It required bargains, blood bargains, and the entities that accepted these offerings never forgot a debt. The winter of 1894 brought a plague that swept through the mountain communities like wildfire. Children burned with fever while their parents watched helplessly, knowing that the nearest doctor was 3 days' ride through treacherous terrain. It was during this desperate time that 5 more families would join the ranks of those who had already made their terrible pacts. Each family faced their own crisis, each found their own dark solution, and each would pass down their cursed legacy through generations of blood and shadow. What makes these particular clans so disturbing isn't just what they did to survive, but how they thrived. While their neighbors struggled with failed crops and dying livestock, these families prospered beyond all logic. Their children grew strong while others withered. Their harvests flourished while others failed. Their influence spread like a cancer through the very foundations of mountain society, reaching into courthouses, churches, and trading posts. The records of their activities were deliberately scattered, hidden in courthouse basements and church archives, sealed away by those who understood that some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve. But fragments remain, testimonies from those who escaped, confessions from deathbed conversions, and always the whispered warnings passed down through generations of mountain folk who knew which hollows to avoid and which family names should never be spoken after dark. Tonight, we venture deeper into this hidden history. We'll uncover the blood-soaked rituals that bound these families to powers older than the mountains themselves. We'll explore how their influence shaped entire regions, creating networks of corruption and supernatural control that persist to this day. And we'll discover why, even now, certain areas of Appalachia remain mysteriously underdeveloped, as if the land itself remembers what was done there. The Cherokee had warnings about these places. They spoke of thin spots where the boundary between worlds grew permeable, where ancient hungers stirred beneath the earth. The first European settlers dismissed these warnings as superstition. They learned too late that some superstitions exist because they're true. When desperation drives people to seek help from the darkness always answers. But its gifts come with a price that extends far beyond the original bargain. These 6 families didn't just practice dark rituals, they became conduits for something far more sinister. They opened doorways that were meant to remain sealed. They invited entities into our world that viewed human suffering as currency and human souls as commodities. And in doing so, they created a legacy of horror that continues to influence the mountain communities even today. The Grayson family established their homestead in a remote valley of eastern Tennessee in 1889, drawn by reports of rich farmland available for practically nothing. What they didn't know was why the land was so cheap. Previous settlers had abandoned the area after a series of unexplained disasters. Crops would flourish one day and be found withered the next. Livestock would disappear without a trace, leaving behind only strange symbols burned into the earth. Children would wander off and return days later with no memory of where they'd been, speaking in languages no one recognized. Marcus Grayson was a proud man who had lost everything in a failed business venture back in Virginia. He arrived in Tennessee with his wife Elena and their 4 children, carrying nothing but their belongings and a determination to rebuild their lives. The first year was brutal. Despite the supposedly fertile soil, their crops failed repeatedly. Their animals sickened and died. By the second winter, they were facing starvation. It was Elena who first heard the whispers. She would later describe them as voices carried on the wind, speaking words that bypassed her ears and resonated directly in her mind. The voices spoke of abundance, of prosperity, of a way to ensure her family would never want for anything again. All they required was acknowledgement, recognition, and a small token of commitment. The ritual Elena performed was deceptively simple. On the night of the winter solstice, she gathered soil from the 4 corners of their property and mixed it with water from their well. To this mixture, she added a single drop of blood from each family member, including the children. The resulting paste was then spread in a circle around their cabin, while Elena recited words that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her memory, though she had never learned them. The change was immediate and dramatic. By spring, the Grayson farm was producing crops of unprecedented quality and quantity. Their animals were healthier and more productive than any in the region. Neighbors began seeking their advice, their seeds, their assistance. The family that had arrived as desperate refugees became the most prosperous farmers in 3 counties. But prosperity came with obligations. Each month, on the night of the new moon, Elena would perform what she called the feeding. She would prepare a mixture of blood, milk, and grain, carrying it to a specific spot in their fields where the earth was always slightly warm, even in winter. She would pour the mixture into a depression in the ground that seemed to absorb it instantly, as if the earth itself was drinking. The Grayson children developed unusual abilities. They could sense weather changes days in advance, predicting droughts and floods with uncanny accuracy. They never became ill, even when diseases swept through neighboring communities. Most disturbing, they seemed to age more slowly than other children, maintaining youthful appearances well into their 20s. As the years passed, the nature of the feeding evolved. The entity that had answered Elena's call began making additional demands. It wanted more than blood and grain. It wanted experiences, emotions, memories. The family would gather monthly to share their most treasured recollections, speaking them aloud into the darkness. Gradually, these memories would fade from their minds, leaving behind only vague impressions and a growing sense of loss. By 1920, the Grayson farm encompassed over 2,000 acres. The family had become one of the wealthiest in the region, with interests in mining, timber, and banking. But they had paid a terrible price. The original family members had become hollow shells of their former selves, their personalities eroded by decades of surrendering their memories to their supernatural patron. The entity's hunger grew with each feeding. It began demanding not just memories, but the memories of others. The Graysons would invite neighbors for dinner, subtly encouraging them to share stories of their past. Guests would leave these gatherings feeling strangely depleted, unable to recall details of their own lives. Some would return home to find that their children no longer recognized them, as if their very identity had been partially consumed. The pattern continued for generations. Each new Grayson patriarch or matriarch would inherit not just the family wealth, but the responsibility of maintaining the feeding. Those who attempted to break the cycle found their attempts met with swift and terrible consequences. Crops would fail overnight. Animals would die in agony. Family members would suffer mysterious illnesses that no doctor could diagnose or cure. The last documented feeding occurred in 1987 when Rebecca Grayson, the final direct descendant, performed the ritual for what she intended to be the final time. She had spent years researching ways to break the family's supernatural contract, consulting with theologians, occultists, and anyone who might have knowledge of such matters. Her attempt to sever the connection resulted in her mysterious disappearance. She was found 3 days later in the center of their fields, her body unmarked, but her mind completely gone. The Grayson property was sold to a development company in 1991, but construction workers reported strange phenomena almost immediately. Equipment would malfunction without explanation. Excavation would reveal strange symbols carved into bedrock. Most disturbing, workers would occasionally find small caches of personal items buried throughout the property, photographs, jewelry, and letters that seemed to span decades, as if the earth itself had been collecting mementos of forgotten lives. Today, the former Grayson land remains largely undeveloped. The development company abandoned the project after a series of accidents and unexplained incidents. Local real estate agents still receive inquiries about the property, but they've learned to discourage potential buyers with vague references to soil contamination and zoning issues. The truth is far more disturbing than any environmental concern. The Brennan family's story begins not with desperation, but with curiosity. In 1891, Patrick Brennan, a scholar and antiquarian from Boston, inherited property in the mountains of western North Carolina from a distant relative he had never met. The inheritance came with a substantial library of books, manuscripts, and artifacts that immediately captured Patrick's academic interest. Among the collection, Patrick discovered texts written in languages he couldn't identify, accompanied by detailed illustrations of symbols and diagrams that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The more he studied these materials, the more convinced he became that they represented a form of knowledge that predated known civilization. The symbols appeared to be instructions for rituals designed to commune with entities that existed beyond normal human perception. Patrick's wife, Catherine, begged him to abandon his research. She had begun experiencing vivid nightmares shortly after they moved to the mountain property. In these dreams, she would find herself in vast underground chambers filled with the sound of whispered conversations in unknown languages. She would wake feeling as though she had been walking for hours, her feet dirty and her clothes damp with moisture that smelled of deep earth and decay. But Patrick was obsessed. He had translated enough of the texts to understand that they promised knowledge beyond anything available through conventional scholarship. The rituals described methods of expanding human consciousness, of perceiving realities normally hidden from mortal senses. The price for such knowledge seemed minimal: a few drops of blood, some simple offerings, and the willingness to serve as a conduit for entities seeking to influence the physical world. The first ritual Patrick performed was designed to enhance his ability to understand the ancient texts. He followed the instructions precisely, creating a circle of symbols using chalk mixed with his own blood, burning specific herbs at cardinal points, and reciting incantations that seemed to vibrate with power even though he didn't fully understand their meaning. The results were immediate and intoxicating. Patrick found that he could now read the ancient texts as easily as English. More than that, he could perceive additional layers of meaning that had been invisible before. The symbols seemed to rearrange themselves as he watched, revealing new instructions and deeper mysteries. He began to understand that the entities described in the texts weren't supernatural beings, but rather advanced intelligences from dimensions parallel to our own. As Patrick's knowledge grew, so did his abilities. He could sense the thoughts and emotions of others, predict future events with startling accuracy, and influence the behavior of people and animals through subtle manipulations of what he came to understand as psychic energy. But each new ability came with a price. The entities that granted this knowledge expected service in return. The services required were initially simple. Patrick would perform rituals at specific times, offering energy and attention to beings that existed primarily as consciousness without physical form. But as his abilities grew, so did the complexity of the tasks required. He began serving as a translator and intermediary, helping these entities understand human society and identify individuals who might be suitable for their purposes. The Brennan family became a nexus of supernatural activity in the region. Their home was visited by a steady stream of individuals seeking Patrick's unique insights and abilities. Some came seeking healing for ailments that conventional medicine couldn't address. Others wanted glimpses of the future or communication with deceased relatives. Patrick provided these services, but each transaction strengthened the connection between his family and the entities they served. Catherine Brennan began manifesting unusual abilities of her own. She could perceive the presence of the entities, even when they weren't actively communicating with Patrick. She described them as shadows that moved independently of any light source, constantly shifting and reforming as they observed human activity. More disturbing, she began to understand that these entities were studying humanity with the detached interest of scientists examining laboratory specimens. The Brennan children, born into this environment of supernatural influence, developed from birth with capabilities that went far beyond normal human potential. They could communicate telepathically with each other and with the entities their father served. They aged at an accelerated rate mentally, while their physical development remained normal, creating the disturbing image of adult intelligence trapped in children's bodies. As the children matured, they began to rebel against their father's work. They had grown up with direct exposure to the entity's true nature and understood the ultimate implications of their family's service. The beings Patrick thought of as advanced intelligences were actually parasitic consciousnesses that fed on human experience and emotion. Their goal wasn't to help humanity evolve, but to gradually consume and replace human consciousness with their own. The rebellion reached a crisis point in 1923 when the eldest Brennan child, Michael, attempted to destroy his father's collection of texts and artifacts. The entities responded with swift and terrible retribution. Michael was found the next morning in his father's study, his body unmarked, but his mind completely gone. He lived for another 40 years, but never again showed any sign of recognition or awareness. Patrick Brennan continued his work until his death in 1935, but the loss of his son had broken something fundamental in his spirit. His later writings, discovered after his death, revealed a man consumed by guilt and regret, desperately seeking a way to undo the damage he had caused. His final journal entry, written the day before his death, contained a single line repeated hundreds of times. "They are not our friends." The Brennan property was abandoned after Patrick's death. Catherine and the surviving children fled to distant states, attempting to escape the influence of the entities their family had served. But the connections forged through decades of ritual and service couldn't be easily severed. Family members continued to experience supernatural phenomena wherever they went, and several died under mysterious circumstances that suggested they had been eliminated for knowing too much about their former patrons. The abandoned Brennan house stood empty for decades, slowly deteriorating, but never quite collapsing entirely. Local residents reported strange lights in the windows and the sound of voices speaking in unknown languages. The property changed hands several times, but new owners never remained for long. Some reported feeling constantly watched, others experienced vivid nightmares, and a few claimed to have encountered shadowy figures that moved through the house as if they still considered it their domain. In 1978, a team of paranormal investigators attempted to document the phenomena at the Brennan property. They spent 3 days in the house, recording hours of audio and video evidence. When they returned to analyze their findings, they discovered that their equipment had recorded nothing but static and distorted sounds that resembled whispered conversations. More disturbing, the investigators found that they could no longer clearly remember what they had experienced during their stay, retaining only vague impressions of unease and the feeling that they had been in the presence of something ancient and malevolent. The property remains abandoned today, though it continues to attract attention from those interested in the paranormal. Local authorities discourage such visits, citing safety concerns about the deteriorating structure, but longtime residents know the real reason the area is avoided. The entities that once worked through the Brennan family are still there, waiting patiently for someone else to discover Patrick's hidden library and continue the work he began over a century ago. The third family to emerge from the winter of 1887 was the Brennan clan, but their story began differently than the others. Where the Graysons had found their entity in the depths of frozen earth, the Brennans discovered theirs in forbidden knowledge. Margaret Brennan, a schoolteacher turned desperate widow with 3 young children, had inherited her late husband's collection of books. Among the mundane volumes of poetry and philosophy lay a single text bound in unfamiliar leather, written in symbols that seemed to shift when viewed directly. The book had come from her husband's travels as a circuit preacher, though he'd never spoken of it. During those brutal months of 1891, as her children grew thin and her savings dwindled, Margaret found herself drawn to the strange volume. The symbols gradually became readable to her, as though her mind was slowly being prepared to understand their meaning. The text spoke of entities that existed in the spaces between thoughts, parasitic intelligences that fed on human consciousness but could provide knowledge and prosperity in return. The ritual the book described was deceptively simple. It required only a willing mind, a circle of salt, and the speaking of words that predated human language. On the night of the winter solstice, Margaret performed the ceremony in her small cabin while her children slept. She reported later that the air itself seemed to thicken, and whispers filled the room in voices that belonged to no living person. The bargain struck was elegant in its horror. The entities would share their vast knowledge, granting her the ability to prosper through supernatural insight. In exchange, they would feed gradually on her family's memories and emotions, sustaining themselves on the very essence of human experience. Margaret agreed, believing she could control the arrangement and limit their access to only her own consciousness. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Margaret's investments, guided by impossible foresight, turned modest savings into substantial wealth. She purchased land throughout the Blue Ridge Mountains, established successful businesses, and gained influence in regional politics. Her children excelled in their studies, displaying knowledge far beyond their years. The Brennan family became known for their uncanny ability to predict market changes, weather patterns, and even human behavior. But the cost became apparent within months. Family members began experiencing what they called the hollow times, periods where entire days or weeks would vanish from their memory. They would find themselves in unfamiliar places with no recollection of how they'd arrived. More disturbing were the moments when they would catch glimpses of their own reflections showing expressions they weren't making, as though something else was looking out through their eyes. The entities, it seemed, were not content with passive feeding. They began actively manipulating the family's thoughts and actions, using their bodies as vessels to experience the physical world. Margaret discovered she could no longer distinguish between her own thoughts and those inserted by the parasitic intelligences. Her children aged rapidly, their faces taking on a haunted quality as their personalities began fragmenting under the constant mental intrusion. The Brennan estate became a center of supernatural activity that drew attention from across the region. Visitors reported hearing conversations in rooms that were empty, seeing figures that cast no shadows, and experiencing sudden memory losses after spending time on the property. The family's servants quit without explanation, and local clergy refused to set foot on their land after several ministers suffered complete mental breakdowns following dinner invitations. In 1897, Margaret's eldest son Thomas attempted to break the family's bargain by destroying the original text. The moment he cast the book into the fireplace, every mirror in the house shattered simultaneously, and the entity's response was swift and terrible. Thomas was found 3 days later, alive but fundamentally changed. He could no longer speak in his own voice, instead serving as a conduit for the parasitic intelligences, delivering messages in languages that scholars couldn't identify. The situation deteriorated further when Margaret's daughter Elizabeth began exhibiting signs of multiple personalities, each claiming to be a different entity seeking a permanent home in her body. The young woman would shift between identities mid-conversation, displaying knowledge and mannerisms that belonged to people who had died decades earlier. Medical professionals who examined her reported that her brain activity showed patterns impossible for a single consciousness. By 1902, the Brennan family had become effectively possessed. Neighbors reported that conversations with family members felt like speaking to different people wearing familiar faces. The entities had learned to perfectly mimic human behavior, but subtle inconsistencies betrayed their true nature. They would reference events that hadn't occurred, speak of people who had never existed, and occasionally forget basic human needs like eating or sleeping. The final tragedy came during the winter of 1903. Margaret, in a moment of clarity, realized that the entities had consumed so much of her family's consciousness that they were essentially becoming hollow shells. In a desperate attempt to save what remained of her children, she gathered them in the estate's library and attempted a binding ritual designed to trap the parasitic intelligences within the house itself. The ritual partially succeeded. The entities were indeed bound to the property, but they took the Brennan family with them. Local authorities found the estate empty, with no signs of struggle or departure. The family had simply vanished, leaving behind only their possessions in a house that now felt fundamentally wrong to anyone who entered it. The Brennan estate remained unoccupied for decades, though it technically remained in the family name through a complex trust arrangement. Those who attempted to purchase or renovate the property reported disturbing experiences. Workers would find their tools rearranged overnight, hear voices calling their names from empty rooms, and discover that their memories of time spent in the house were fragmented and unreliable. Several paranormal investigators attempted to document the phenomena in the 1920s and 1930s, but their efforts were consistently sabotaged by equipment malfunctions and psychological disturbances. One researcher's journal, discovered years later, contained increasingly erratic entries describing conversations with entities that claimed to be the original Brennan family members, but possessed a knowledge they couldn't possibly have. The most disturbing aspect of the Brennan legacy was its apparent ability to spread. People who spent extended time on the property or who studied the family's history too closely began experiencing similar symptoms. They would report gaps in their memory, thoughts that didn't feel like their own, and the sensation of being watched by something that existed just beyond perception. During the 1940s, federal authorities quietly sealed the estate and classified all related documentation. The official records were destroyed, and the property was transferred to a government agency that specialized in unusual phenomena. Local residents were discouraged from discussing the family through a combination of legal pressure and financial incentives. Modern paranormal researchers have attempted to investigate the Brennan case, but their efforts are consistently hindered by missing records, uncooperative witnesses, and the fact that the estate itself remains off-limits to civilian access. Satellite imagery shows the property is maintained but appears to be uninhabited, with no signs of recent human activity. The few documents that survive suggest that the entities originally contacted by Margaret Brennan were part of a larger network of parasitic intelligences that exist in the liminal spaces of human consciousness. These beings appear to be drawn to areas where multiple traumatic events have occurred, feeding on the psychic residue of extreme emotions and gradually establishing permanent footholds in our reality. What makes the Brennan case particularly significant is that it represents one of the earliest documented instances of human consciousness being systematically harvested by non-human entities. The family's fate serves as a warning about the dangers of seeking knowledge from sources that exist outside normal human experience, and the terrible price of bargains made with intelligences that view human consciousness as nothing more than sustenance. The influence of the Brennan family's actions extends far beyond their abandoned estate. Genealogical research suggests that distant relatives of the family have continued to experience unusual phenomena throughout the generations. These descendants report dreams filled with whispers and unknown languages, sudden knowledge of events they never experienced, and the persistent feeling that their thoughts are not entirely their own. Local folklore in the Blue Ridge Mountains still contains references to the Brennan legacy, though the stories have been deliberately obscured and fragmented over time. Older residents speak in hushed tones about the family that fed their souls to hungry shadows, and certain areas of the mountains are still avoided by those who remember the old warnings. The entities that once fed on the Brennan family consciousness appear to remain active, though contained within the boundaries of their original estate. Security reports from the classified site mention ongoing anomalous activity, including electromagnetic disturbances, temperature fluctuations, and audio recordings that capture voices speaking in the extinct dialects of long-dead civilizations. Perhaps most troubling is the possibility that the Brennan case represents not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of supernatural predation that has been occurring in Appalachian communities for generations. The parasitic intelligences that consumed the family may be connected to the same forces that influenced the other clans, suggesting a coordinated effort to establish footholds in human reality through vulnerable mountain communities. The knowledge contained in Margaret Brennan's original text, though the book itself was destroyed, may have been preserved in other forms. Researchers have identified similar symbols and references in documents connected to various Appalachian families, suggesting that the forbidden knowledge continues to circulate among those desperate enough to seek supernatural solutions to their problems. The Brennan family's story serves as a stark reminder that some forms of help come with prices that extend far beyond the original bargain. Their fate illustrates the danger of entities that offer knowledge and prosperity while slowly consuming the very essence of human identity, leaving behind only hollow shells that serve as vessels for alien consciousness. In the decades since their disappearance, the Brennan name has become synonymous with the cautionary tale of intellectual curiosity turned deadly. Their legacy continues to influence how supernatural phenomena are investigated and contained, serving as a case study in the systematic consumption of human consciousness by parasitic entities that exist in the spaces between thoughts. The sealed estate remains a testament to the family's fate, a place where the boundaries between human and non-human consciousness have been permanently blurred. Those who monitor the site report that the entities within seem to be waiting, patient in their hunger, ready to resume their feeding should the barriers that contain them ever fail. Now we turn to the fourth family, whose descent into darkness began not with desperation, but with ambition. The Brennans of Copper Ridge arrived in the mountains of eastern Tennessee in 1894 with dreams of establishing a mining empire. Unlike the other families who stumbled into their supernatural bargains through circumstance, the Brennans actively sought out the forbidden knowledge that would become their curse. Patrick Brennan had heard whispers during his travels through Ireland of ancient practices that could guarantee prosperity to those bold enough to attempt them. When conventional mining methods failed to yield the copper deposits he'd been promised, Patrick turned to rituals he'd learned from a dying hedge witch in County Cork. The ceremonies required specific conditions: a blood moon, a circle of 13 stones arranged in precise astronomical alignment, and offerings that grew progressively more demanding with each success. The initial ritual took place in October 1895, during the first blood moon after their arrival. Patrick carved symbols into his forearms with a copper blade, allowing his blood to pool in a bowl made from local clay. As he chanted words in a language that predated English, the ground beneath his feet began to vibrate. The next morning, his mining team discovered copper veins so rich they seemed to glow with their own inner light. But the entity that answered Patrick's call was not content with simple blood offerings. Each month, as the Brennan fortune grew, the demands escalated. First, it required animal sacrifices, then personal belongings of great sentimental value, then memories themselves. Family members began forgetting their childhoods, their wedding days, their happiest moments, trading these precious recollections for continued prosperity. The most disturbing transformation occurred in the Brennan children. Born into a household where supernatural forces were commonplace, they developed abilities that terrified even their parents. Young Michael Brennan could sense copper deposits by touch, pressing his palms against rock faces and describing the mineral content with uncanny accuracy. His sister Margaret aged backwards during full moons, her adult consciousness trapped in a child's body that grew younger with each passing month. The family's mining operation expanded rapidly, but so did the supernatural incidents surrounding their properties. Workers reported tools that moved on their own, reshaping themselves into configurations that improved efficiency but resembled no human design. The copper extracted from Brennan mines possessed unusual properties, conducting electricity far more effectively than normal ore and occasionally emitting strange harmonics when struck. Local churches refused to perform services for the Brennan family after several priests reported experiencing vivid hallucinations during attempted blessings. One clergyman described seeing Patrick's reflection in the copper fixtures as something that was decidedly not human, with features that shifted and flowed like molten metal. The family's downfall came in 1923 when Patrick's grandson, Thomas, attempted to break the generational pact. He gathered all the family's ritual implements and threw them into the deepest mine shaft, believing this would sever their connection to the entity. Instead, the action triggered what witnesses described as a supernatural implosion. The entire mining complex collapsed in a matter of minutes, but the devastation followed an impossible pattern, with buildings folding in on themselves rather than simply falling. When rescue teams arrived, they found no bodies, only empty clothes arranged in perfect circles throughout the ruins. The copper deposits had vanished as well, leaving behind caverns filled with a substance that resembled liquid shadow. Most unnervingly, the family's house remained completely intact, sitting undisturbed in the center of the destruction. The Brennan property remains uninhabitable to this day. Electronic devices malfunction within a quarter-mile radius, and compasses spin wildly when brought near the old homestead. Local historians have documented over 40 unexplained disappearances in the area since 1923, all involving people who ventured too close to the abandoned mine shafts. Recent investigations have revealed that the Brennan bloodline continues through distant relatives who inherited not just the family's wealth, but their supernatural afflictions. These descendants report dreams of copper-colored entities that speak in Patrick's voice, offering the same bargains that destroyed the original family. Several have been found dead in their homes, their bodies positioned in ritual circles with copper coins covering their eyes. The final family whose story we must tell represents perhaps the most tragic example of how desperate circumstances can lead to unthinkable choices. The Ashfords settled in the remote valleys of western North Carolina in 1902, fleeing racial violence in Georgia. As a mixed-race family in an era of increasing segregation, they found themselves unwelcome in established communities and forced to carve out an existence in the most isolated corners of the mountains. Sarah Ashford was a woman of remarkable intelligence and fierce determination, but even her considerable skills couldn't overcome the systematic persecution her family faced. When local authorities began making inquiries about their legal status and right to own property, Sarah realized they needed protection that conventional means couldn't provide. The ritual that would define the Ashford legacy began with Sarah's desperate prayer to whatever forces might be listening. She had discovered references to protective ceremonies in her grandmother's journal, practices that traced back to African traditions blended with Native American spiritual beliefs. The ritual required the participation of all family members and involved creating a spiritual barrier around their land that would turn away hostile intentions. The ceremony took place during the winter solstice of 1903, with the entire family gathered in a circle around their cabin. Sarah had prepared a mixture of herbs, soil from their grandmother's grave, and drops of blood from each family member. As they chanted and moved in prescribed patterns, the air around them began to shimmer with an almost visible energy. The protection worked, but at a cost none of them had anticipated. While their land became a sanctuary where they could live in peace, the family members found themselves increasingly unable to leave, not physically prevented, but psychologically compelled to remain within the boundaries they had established. Anyone who ventured too far from the homestead experienced overwhelming anxiety and disorientation until they returned. More disturbing was the gradual change in their perception of time. Days blended into weeks, seasons passed without notice, and family members began aging at different rates. Sarah's youngest son appeared to stop aging entirely at age 12, while her daughter aged rapidly, becoming an elderly woman within a decade of the ritual. The Ashford property became a place outside normal reality, where visitors reported experiencing temporal displacement. A traveling merchant who stopped for water in 1915 emerged from the valley claiming only minutes had passed, though local records show he'd been missing for 3 weeks. His hair had turned completely white, and he spoke obsessively about hearing voices from different time periods overlapping in the same space. The family's isolation deepened as generations passed. They became self-sufficient to an impossible degree, with crops that grew year-round despite the mountain climate, and livestock that never seemed to age or die. Neighbors who glimpsed the property from distant ridges reported seeing figures moving through the fields, but these silhouettes appeared to be from different time periods, some in modern clothing, others in styles that wouldn't exist for decades. The Ashford curse reached its climax in 1967 when a surveyor accidentally breached the spiritual boundary while mapping the area for a proposed highway. He found the family's cabin exactly as it had been in 1903, with Sarah still alive but aged beyond any natural lifespan. Her descendants existed in a state of temporal suspension, some appearing as children, others as elderly adults, all trapped in the moment of their ritual's completion. The surveyor's report was classified immediately, and the highway project was rerouted without explanation. Official records list the Ashford property as uninhabitable due to geological instability, but locals know the truth. The family remains trapped in their self-imposed sanctuary, living in a bubble of distorted time that protects them from the outside world while slowly consuming their humanity. Recent satellite imagery shows the property still exists, with structures that appear to phase in and out of visibility depending on atmospheric conditions. Hikers report hearing conversations carried on the wind, fragments of discussions that seem to span decades, with voices young and old discussing events from different time periods as if they were happening simultaneously. The most chilling aspect of the Ashford legacy is the discovery that their temporal distortion is gradually expanding. Surveyors have noted that the affected area grows by several feet each year, suggesting that eventually their bubble of disrupted time might encompass the entire valley. Scientists who have studied the phenomenon theorized that the family's desperation created a wound in reality itself, a place where time moves according to emotional rather than physical laws. These six families represent more than just cautionary tales about the dangers of seeking supernatural solutions to earthly problems. They demonstrate how desperation, ambition, and the isolation of the Appalachian Mountains created conditions where the impossible became inevitable. Each family's story follows a similar pattern. Initial success, followed by escalating demands, supernatural abilities that came with terrible costs, and eventual destruction or transformation that removed them from normal human existence. The legacy of their choices continues to haunt the mountains today. Local residents speak of areas where the normal rules don't apply, where time moves strangely, where the landscape itself seems to remember the rituals performed upon it. These families didn't just make deals with supernatural forces, they fundamentally altered the nature of reality in their corner of the world. Perhaps most disturbing is the evidence that their practices have influenced subsequent generations. Researchers have documented unusual patterns in the descendants of these families, even those who moved far from the mountains. Higher than normal rates of precognitive dreams, unusual longevity, and an inexplicable ability to find resources during times of crisis suggest that the supernatural changes affected their bloodlines permanently. The mountains themselves seem to bear the scars of these ancient bargains. Geological surveys have identified areas where the rock formations follow patterns that shouldn't exist naturally, as if the earth itself was reshaped by forces beyond human understanding. These locations remain sites of unusual activity, with wildlife avoiding certain areas and electronic equipment malfunctioning without explanation. The story of these six families serves as a reminder that in the deepest hollows of Appalachia, where civilization's reach has always been tenuous, the boundary between the natural and supernatural remains dangerously thin. Their legacy continues to influence the region, creating pockets of altered reality where the desperate bargains of the past continue to extract their price from the present. The mountains remember, and what they remember shapes the lives of those who dare to call them home. The darkness runs deeper than most dare to acknowledge. The Brennan family understood this fundamental truth when they established their hold over 3 counties in southwestern Virginia, creating what locals called the Bleeding Triangle. Between 1889 and 1934, the Brennans didn't just control territory through violence or intimidation like other mountain clans. They wielded something far more insidious, the ability to harvest and manipulate human suffering itself. The family's patriarch, Silas Brennan, had been a battlefield surgeon during the Civil War, but his experiences at Antietam changed him in ways that military records could never capture. He returned to the mountains carrying more than medical knowledge. In his leather satchel, alongside bone saws and morphine, he transported something he'd discovered in the aftermath of mass casualties. Something that fed on the final moments of the dying and grew stronger with each soul that passed through his hands. By 1889, the Brennans had established what appeared to be a legitimate medical practice serving remote mountain communities. Their compound, built into a natural cave system, housed both living quarters and what Silas called his research facilities. The family's reputation for miraculous healing drew desperate families from across the region. What they didn't realize was that every cure came with a hidden cost, and the Brennans had developed an appetite for payment that went far beyond money. The harvesting ritual began simply enough. Patients would be brought to the deepest chamber of the cave system, where Silas had constructed an elaborate surgical theater. The walls were lined with mirrors, positioned at specific angles, creating an infinite reflection that seemed to trap light rather than reflect it. In the center stood an operating table carved from a single piece of black stone, its surface worn smooth by decades of use. Surrounding this table were smaller pedestals, each holding glass containers filled with what appeared to be ordinary medical specimens. But these containers held something far more valuable: concentrated human anguish. The Brennan technique involved a precise understanding of human anatomy combined with knowledge that no medical school taught. They discovered that suffering, properly extracted and preserved, could be used to heal other ailments. But the process required living subjects, and the extraction had to occur during moments of peak emotional distress. Silas developed instruments that could prolong death, keeping patients conscious and aware while slowly removing not just their physical vitality, but their capacity for hope, love, and peace. Each member of the Brennan family specialized in different aspects of the harvesting. Silas handled the medical procedures, his hands steady, despite the tremor that had developed after his first successful extraction. His wife, Constance, possessed an uncanny ability to identify which patients carried the specific type of suffering the family needed. Their 3 children were trained from birth to recognize the subtle signs of spiritual energy and to maintain the complex equipment needed for preservation. The process began with what patients believed was a standard examination. They would be led to the surgical chamber, where Constance would conduct what she called a spiritual assessment. Using a combination of hypnosis and herbal preparations, she would guide patients into a trance state where their deepest fears and traumas became accessible. The family had learned that fresh trauma produced the most potent essence, but layered generational suffering created the most durable extracts. Once the assessment was complete, Silas would begin the harvesting procedure. Using instruments that resembled surgical tools but were crafted from materials that seemed to absorb light, he would make precise incisions that followed nerve pathways rather than anatomical structures. The cuts were designed not to cause death, but to create specific patterns of pain that would resonate with the patient's psychological wounds. As the suffering intensified, a faint luminescence would appear around the wounds, visible only in the mirrors that surrounded the operating table. The extraction itself required perfect timing. At the moment when the patient's anguish reached its peak, Silas would use a hollow needle connected to the glass containers to draw out what he called the essence of despair. The substance that emerged was neither blood nor any bodily fluid, but something that moved like liquid mercury and glowed with a sickly phosphorescence. This essence, when properly preserved, could be used to treat everything from consumption to madness in other patients. But the true horror of the Brennan practice lay in what happened to the donors. Those who survived the harvesting process were left fundamentally changed. They retained their memories and physical abilities, but their capacity for emotional experience was permanently diminished. They could no longer feel joy, love, or even basic contentment. Instead, they existed in a state of emotional numbness that made them ideal servants for the family's expanding operations. The Brennans called these transformed individuals their shepherds, and they served multiple purposes within the family's organization. They felt no empathy, making them perfect for luring new victims to the compound. They experienced no fear, allowing them to carry out tasks that would terrify normal people. Most importantly, they remained completely loyal to the family, having lost the emotional capacity to question or resist their commands. By 1910, the Brennans had accumulated enough harvested essence to begin their most ambitious project. They discovered that by combining extracts from different types of suffering, they could create what they called symphonies of anguish. These concentrated mixtures, when properly administered, could induce specific emotional states in entire communities. A symphony of despair could drive a town to mass suicide. A symphony of rage could incite violence that would destroy social bonds for generations. The family's influence spread through calculated deployment of these emotional weapons. They would identify communities with resources they wanted to control, then gradually introduce their symphonies through the water supply, food distribution, or even the air itself. Within months, entire populations would be reduced to emotionally compromised states that made them easy to manipulate and control. The Brennans' most devastating success came in 1924, when they orchestrated the collapse of 3 mining towns simultaneously. Using symphonies of hopelessness, they drove the populations to abandon their homes and businesses, leaving behind valuable coal deposits and timber rights that the family quickly claimed. The official records attributed the mass exodus to economic hardship, but survivors described a collective despair so profound that many couldn't remember why they had once found life worth living. The family's practices might have continued indefinitely if not for an unexpected development. In 1932, one of their shepherds began to recover emotional capacity, something the Brennans had believed impossible. This individual, a former schoolteacher named Margaret Whitmore, had been harvested in 1919 and had served the family faithfully for over a decade. But something in her began to heal, and with that healing came the horrifying realization of what she had become and what she had helped the family accomplish. Margaret's recovery was gradual, beginning with the return of basic emotions like curiosity and concern. As her capacity for feeling returned, she began to understand the true nature of the Brennan operation. She realized that the family had created a network of harvested individuals across multiple states, all serving as unwitting agents in a vast emotional manipulation scheme. More disturbing, she discovered that the family was preparing to expand their operations nationally, using the economic chaos of the Great Depression as cover for mass harvesting. The Brennan downfall began when Margaret started secretly documenting the family's activities. She had retained her literacy and organizational skills, making her uniquely qualified to create a comprehensive record of their crimes. Working over several months, she compiled detailed accounts of hundreds of harvesting procedures, maps of the cave system, and most critically, the locations of other shepherd networks across the region. Margaret's documentation revealed the true scope of the Brennan operation. They had established harvesting facilities in 7 states, each one disguised as a medical clinic or charitable organization. The family had created a supply chain of human suffering that fed into pharmaceutical companies, religious organizations, and even government agencies. They had been selling concentrated anguish to anyone willing to pay, regardless of how it would be used. The final confrontation came in October 1934, when Margaret led a group of recovering shepherds in a coordinated attack on the main compound. The assault was timed to coincide with a major harvesting ceremony, when the entire family would be present in the surgical chamber. The shepherds, driven by a combination of recovered emotion and mechanical precision, proved to be devastatingly effective combatants. The battle in the cave system lasted 3 days. The Brennans had prepared defensive measures, including the ability to flood the tunnels with concentrated symphonies of terror. But the attacking shepherds, having already experienced the worst possible emotional states, proved largely immune to these psychological weapons. They methodically destroyed the harvesting equipment, shattered the essence containers, and sealed the deeper chambers where the family's most valuable supplies were stored. When authorities finally arrived, they found the compound in ruins. The Brennan family had vanished, though whether through death or escape remained unclear. The surviving shepherds, their emotional capacity gradually returning, provided testimony that led to the discovery of additional facilities across the region. However, the investigation was quietly terminated by federal authorities, and all evidence was classified under national security provisions. The aftermath of the Brennan exposure created ripple effects that extended far beyond their immediate territory. Communities that had been subjected to their emotional manipulation began to recover, but the healing process was slow and incomplete. Many individuals never fully regained their capacity for joy or love, leaving entire generations emotionally diminished. The economic and social structures that had been built on artificially induced despair collapsed, creating power vacuums that other entities quickly moved to fill. Modern researchers who have studied the scattered records of the Brennan operation describe it as one of the most sophisticated psychological warfare campaigns in American history. The family had essentially weaponized human emotion, creating a technology of suffering that could be deployed on a massive scale. Their techniques predated formal research into psychological manipulation by decades, suggesting access to knowledge that conventional science had not yet developed. The Brennan legacy continues to influence the region in subtle but persistent ways. Areas that were subjected to their symphonies of anguish show statistically higher rates of depression, suicide, and social dysfunction even today. Local mental health professionals report treating patients whose symptoms don't match any recognized psychological condition, describing instead a profound emptiness that seems to resist conventional therapy. Perhaps most disturbing are the reports from descendants of the original shepherds. These individuals, born decades after the Brennan operation ended, sometimes display the same emotional numbness that characterized their ancestors. They function normally in most respects, but lack the full range of human feeling that defines normal emotional experience. Some researchers suggest this represents a form of inherited trauma, while others propose more unsettling explanations. The Brennan story serves as a reminder that the darkest chapters of Appalachian history involve more than simple violence or criminal enterprise. And some families discovered ways to corrupt the fundamental nature of human experience itself, creating wounds that persist across generations. In their pursuit of power and control, they didn't just harm individuals, they damaged the very fabric of human emotional connection in ways that continue to reverberate through the mountain communities they once terrorized. Deep in the mountainous heart of Appalachia, where ancient ridges pierce the sky like the backbone of some slumbering giant, the Brennan clan carved out their existence in 1834. Unlike the other families we've explored, the Brennans didn't stumble upon their dark bargain through desperation or chance encounter. They sought it deliberately, methodically, with the calculated precision of scholars who understood exactly what they were inviting into their bloodline. Silas Brennan arrived in the remote hollows of eastern Tennessee, carrying more than just the typical settler's possessions. His wagon contained dozens of leather-bound volumes, ancient texts written in languages that predated European settlement, manuscripts that legitimate universities would have declared heretical or impossible. Silas wasn't fleeing poverty or persecution. He was a man of education, a former professor of antiquarian studies who had been quietly dismissed from 3 separate institutions for his research into what he called the old contracts. The Brennans established their compound in a valley that local Cherokee had abandoned decades earlier, though tribal elders would never explain why. The land itself seemed to resist habitation. Crops grew in twisted, unnatural patterns. Water sources would mysteriously shift location overnight. Wildlife avoided the area entirely, creating an eerie silence that seemed to absorb sound rather than simply lacking it. For 5 years, Silas meticulously prepared. He studied the geological formations, tracked celestial movements, and most importantly, decoded the symbols he'd found carved into limestone caves throughout the region. These weren't random markings, but part of an elaborate system, a kind of ancient cartography that mapped not physical territory, but something far more dangerous. The Brennan ritual, which family descendants called the Awakening, required precise timing and specific bloodline participation. On the winter solstice of 1839, during a rare lunar eclipse, Silas gathered his wife Martha and their 3 children in the deepest chamber of their property. The cave walls were covered with the symbols he'd spent years deciphering, each one carved with obsessive precision and filled with a mixture of iron oxide and human blood. What distinguished the Brennan practice from other families was its intellectual approach. This wasn't desperate bargaining or emotional pleading. Silas had spent decades researching what he believed were entities that existed parallel to human reality, beings of vast intelligence that could be negotiated with if one understood the proper protocols. His journals, fragments of which survived in private collections, described these entities not as supernatural beings, but as representatives of an older science, a knowledge that predates human civilization by millennia. The awakening ceremony involved each family member consuming a specially prepared mixture while reciting incantations in a language Silas had reconstructed from his research. The substance, according to his notes, contained elements that shouldn't exist in nature, minerals that seemed to shift between different states of matter, depending on lunar phases and underground magnetic fields. The immediate effects were subtle but profound. The Brennans began demonstrating abilities that seemed to defy natural law. They could predict weather patterns with uncanny accuracy, locate water sources in drought-stricken regions, and most remarkably, they appeared to age at a dramatically slower rate than normal humans. Martha Brennan, who was 35 during the awakening, appeared barely 20 when she died in 1891 at the age of 87. More disturbing were the intellectual enhancements. Brennan children displayed genius-level intelligence from early ages, solving complex mathematical problems without formal education and demonstrating intuitive understanding of engineering and natural sciences. They designed and built mechanical devices that were decades ahead of their time, creating water mills, mining equipment, and agricultural tools that neighboring communities couldn't replicate despite studying the designs. The price for these gifts became apparent gradually. Each generation of Brennans was required to contribute what they called the offering to maintain their enhanced abilities. This wasn't a simple blood sacrifice, but something far more complex. Family members had to surrender specific memories, carefully selected experiences that the entities required for reasons that remained mysterious, even to the Brennans themselves. The process was methodical and precise. Using techniques described in Silas's texts, family members would enter deep meditative states, while other relatives performed ritualistic procedures designed to extract and preserve specific memories. These weren't random recollections, but targeted experiences, often the most emotionally significant moments of a person's life. First loves, the births of children, moments of profound joy or devastating loss, all carefully harvested and somehow transferred to the entities they served. Those who underwent the memory extraction emerged fundamentally changed. They retained their enhanced abilities and extended lifespans, but they became increasingly detached from normal human emotion. Brennan descendants described feeling as though they were observing life through glass, understanding intellectually what others experienced emotionally, but unable to fully participate in the human experience. The family's influence grew exponentially over the decades. They established the region's first successful mining operations, not through luck or hard work, but through their supernatural ability to locate valuable mineral deposits. Their agricultural innovations transformed farming throughout eastern Tennessee. They built the first reliable roads through previously impassable mountain terrain, using engineering techniques that baffled contemporary experts. By the 1880s, the Brennans had become one of the most influential families in the region, their innovations and investments touching nearly every aspect of local economy and infrastructure. They funded schools, libraries, and hospitals, always maintaining a public facade of benevolent community leadership while conducting their true business in the hidden chambers beneath their expanding compound. The most unsettling aspect of the Brennan legacy was their record keeping. Unlike other families who practiced their rituals in secret, the Brennans documented everything with scientific precision. Their archives, discovered decades later, contained detailed records of each ceremony, precise measurements of environmental conditions, and most disturbingly, catalogs of the memories they had harvested from family members across generations. These documents revealed that the Brennans understood their practices as part of a larger system. They weren't simply making individual bargains, but participating in what Silas called the grand cultivation. According to his theories, the entities they served were engaged in a long-term project involving human consciousness itself, using families like the Brennans to harvest and preserve specific types of human experience for purposes that remained beyond human comprehension. The Brennan line continued their practices well into the 20th century, adapting their methods to modern technology while maintaining the core rituals established by Silas. During the Great Depression, they were among the few families whose fortunes actually increased, their supernatural insights allowing them to predict market fluctuations and identify profitable investments with impossible accuracy. World War II brought unprecedented scrutiny to the region, and government investigators began questioning the Brennan family's unusual influence and capabilities. Military intelligence officers investigating reports of advanced technology in rural Tennessee discovered equipment in Brennan facilities that seemed decades ahead of contemporary engineering. When pressed for explanations, family members provided technical specifications that proved both accurate and impossible to understand using conventional scientific knowledge. The investigation intensified when several government agents reported experiencing severe psychological effects after extended contact with Brennan family members. These effects included vivid nightmares, temporary memory loss, and in several cases, complete personality changes that required psychiatric intervention. The official reports, most of which remain classified, described these incidents as unprecedented psychological phenomena requiring immediate containment protocols. In 1943, the Brennan compound was quietly evacuated under the pretense of military requisition. The family disappeared overnight, leaving behind only empty buildings and the extensive underground chambers where their ceremonies had taken place. Government teams spent months cataloging and removing materials from the site, though no official inventory of their discoveries was ever made public. The most disturbing find was in the deepest chamber, where investigators discovered what appeared to be a vast library containing thousands of preserved memories. These weren't written records, but physical objects, crystalline structures that seemed to contain actual human experiences. When researchers attempted to study these artifacts, several suffered complete mental breakdowns, reporting that they had experienced decades of foreign memories and emotions that weren't their own. The Brennan properties were eventually sealed and designated as restricted federal land, though locals report that the restrictions are enforced by security measures that seem far more extensive than typical government installations. Hikers who venture too close to the former compound describe experiencing disorientation, temporary memory loss, and the overwhelming sensation of being observed by unseen watchers. Modern investigations into the Brennan legacy have been complicated by the fact that their descendants appear to have integrated into society while maintaining their enhanced abilities. Genealogical research suggests that Brennan bloodlines can be traced to several prominent families in academia, technology, and finance, though these connections are difficult to verify due to the family's sophisticated methods of obscuring their lineage. The most recent documented Brennan activity occurred in 1987 when a technology company in Silicon Valley released a series of patents for computer processing techniques that were decades ahead of contemporary capabilities. The patents were filed under various corporate names, but research into the company's ownership structure revealed connections to financial entities that could be traced back to the original Brennan holdings in Tennessee. More troubling are reports from technology workers who claim to have encountered individuals displaying the characteristic Brennan traits, the uncanny intelligence, the ageless appearance, and most distinctively, the emotional detachment that family members developed after undergoing memory extraction. These individuals reportedly appear at crucial moments in technological development, providing insights that accelerate innovation in ways that seem almost supernatural. The Brennan understanding of their practices as part of a larger system raises disturbing questions about the true scope of these mountain bargains. If Silas's theories were correct, the various families we've explored weren't isolated incidents, but components of a vast network, each contributing different elements to a project that spans generations and possibly centuries. What remains most unsettling about the Brennan legacy is how successfully they've adapted their practices to the modern world, while other families either disappeared or were destroyed by their supernatural bargains. The Brennans evolved, using their enhanced abilities to integrate into contemporary society while maintaining their fundamental relationship with the entities they serve. Their story suggests that the old contracts they haven't been abandoned, but have simply moved beyond the isolated mountain hollows where they originated. The same forces that once demanded blood and memory in remote Appalachian caves may now be operating through corporate boardrooms and research laboratories, continuing their mysterious cultivation of human experience on a scale that would have been impossible in Silas Brennan's time. The mountains remember, but the Brennans learned to make the entire world forget. These mountain hollows have always been places where time moves differently, where the old ways persist in defiance of the modern world. Even today, when satellites map every ridge and cell towers pierce the highest peaks, there remain valleys that resist documentation, families whose names appear in no census, and traditions that continue in shadows cast by ancient peaks. The descendants of these 6 clans didn't simply vanish when their ancestors made their final offerings. They adapted, evolved, and found new ways to honor bargains that transcend generations. In corporate boardrooms and small town councils, in hospitals and schools, in the quiet corners of Appalachian life, their influence persists like morning mist that never quite burns away in the sun. The Grayson financial empire, built on that first blood offering in a limestone cave, transformed into something far more sophisticated than crude mining operations. By the 1960s, Grayson Holdings had become a sprawling conglomerate with interests in banking, real estate, and technology. But at its heart, the company still operated according to the same principles that Samuel Grayson had learned in those underground chambers over a century before. Every major business decision was made in the building's sub-basement, in a conference room where the walls were lined with the same dark stone that had formed the original cave. The current CEO, Maria Grayson, conducted quarterly meetings there, though she was careful never to schedule them during regular business hours. Employees who worked late occasionally heard voices drifting up through the ventilation system, speaking in cadences that seemed to echo from somewhere far deeper than the building's foundation. The company's success rate remained inexplicably high. Market crashes that devastated competitors barely affected Grayson Holdings. Economic downturns that closed banks throughout the region somehow strengthened their position. Industry analysts attributed this to shrewd planning and conservative investments, but those who looked closely at the numbers found patterns that defied conventional explanation. Every major acquisition was preceded by a series of small accidents befalling the target company's executives. Nothing fatal, Nothing that couldn't be explained by stress or coincidence, but always enough to create the desperation necessary for a favorable sale. Competitors who challenged Grayson Holdings directly found their operations plagued by equipment failures, regulatory investigations, and key personnel suddenly resigning without explanation. The physical toll on the Grayson family had evolved as well. Where their ancestors had aged prematurely and died young, the modern generation seemed to exist in a state of suspended animation. Maria, now in her 70s, appeared no older than 40. Her children, both in their 50s, could pass for college students, but employees who worked closely with them reported something unsettling about their presence. A coldness that seemed to emanate from within their bones. They cast no reflection in the polished surfaces of the executive floors. Security cameras malfunctioned whenever they passed, and on the anniversary of that first offering, every clock in the building stopped at exactly 3:33 a.m., the precise moment when Samuel Grayson had made his desperate bargain in the cave below. The Brennan healing legacy had found its way into the modern medical establishment through a network of family members who had become doctors, nurses, and hospital administrators throughout the region. St. Margaret's Hospital, named for the family's matriarch, stood as the premier medical facility in 3 counties, known for its miraculous recovery rates and inexplicable ability to save patients that other hospitals had given up on. But the true healing still happened in the old ways, in the basement levels that didn't appear on any building plans. Patients who arrived at death's door were sometimes offered a choice: accept conventional treatment with its limited prospects, or trust in something older, more effective, and infinitely more costly. Those who chose the old way were taken to chambers where the walls were lined with roots and herbs, where the air itself seemed to pulse with life. The current Brennan healer, Dr. Elizabeth Brennan, had inherited not just the family gift, but its terrible burden. She could cure any ailment, reverse any injury, even coax the recently dead back to life. But each healing required a transfer, a balance that had to be maintained. The hospital's psychiatric ward housed a wing of patients who had no visitors, no insurance, no records of admission. These were the carriers, individuals who had volunteered or been volunteered to bear the illnesses that Dr. Brennan drew from her patients. They suffered in silence, their conditions managed but never cured, their pain serving as the foundation for miracles that happened floors above. Local medical schools reported unusual difficulties in their cadaver programs. Bodies donated for research would mysteriously disappear from morgues, leaving behind only traces of ash and the lingering scent of mountain herbs. Students who asked too many questions about these incidents found their academic progress suddenly hampered by failing grades and lost paperwork. The Brennan family's personal cost had multiplied with their expanded operations, where their ancestors had aged rapidly from absorbing individual ailments. The modern generation bore the accumulated suffering of thousands. They moved through the world like walking repositories of human pain, their eyes holding depths of anguish that made direct eye contact almost unbearable. Yet they continued their work, driven by the same compulsion that had motivated their ancestors. They had become collectors of suffering, curators of pain, and their hospital stood as a monument to the terrible mathematics of healing. For every life saved, another must be sacrificed. For every miracle, a corresponding darkness must be fed. The Ashford political dynasty had grown into one of the most powerful families in Appalachian politics, with representatives in state governments, federal positions, and local offices throughout the region. Their influence extended far beyond electoral politics into the machinery of governance itself, the bureaucracies and institutions that shaped daily life for millions. The family's ancestral gift for reading and manipulating human emotion had evolved into something far more sophisticated than simple crowd control. They had learned to harvest not just the raw energy of fear and anger, but the subtler emotions that drove human behavior: hope, guilt, pride, and desperate need for belonging. Political rallies hosted by Ashford candidates became almost ritualistic experiences. Attendees arrived as individuals, but left as part of something larger, their personal doubts and concerns dissolved into collective purpose. The speeches themselves were carefully crafted to create specific emotional responses, building toward crescendos that left audiences in states of near religious fervor. But the true power was exercised in private, in the network of offices and meeting rooms where the real decisions were made. The Ashfords had learned to read the emotional landscape of their colleagues with supernatural precision, knowing exactly which fears to exploit, which ambitions to nurture, and which secrets to leverage for maximum effect. The family maintained detailed psychological profiles on every significant political figure in the region, updated constantly by a network of staff members who had been trained to recognize and catalog emotional responses. These files, stored in a secure facility that officially didn't exist, contained information that went far beyond conventional opposition research. They knew which judges could be influenced through appeals to their vanity, which prosecutors could be swayed by subtle threats to their families, and which business leaders could be controlled through careful manipulation of their deepest insecurities. The Ashford political machine operated like a vast psychological instrument, playing human emotions with the precision of a master musician. The family's children were raised from birth to recognize and exploit emotional vulnerabilities. By adolescence, they could read micro-expressions, vocal patterns, and body language with uncanny accuracy. They learned to present different faces to different audiences, becoming whatever each person needed them to be in order to gain compliance. The cost of this power manifested in their personal relationships. Ashford family members found it impossible to form genuine emotional connections with others. They experienced human interaction only as a series of transactions, manipulations, and strategic moves. Their marriages were political alliances, their friendships were networking opportunities, and their children were assets to be developed and deployed. Among themselves, they existed in a state of constant emotional warfare, each family member simultaneously allied with and plotting against the others. Family dinners became exercises in psychological combat, with conversations layered with hidden meanings and emotional traps. The political landscape they had created was one of perpetual instability, where public opinion could be shifted overnight through carefully orchestrated campaigns of emotional manipulation. Citizens found themselves supporting policies they didn't understand, voting for candidates they couldn't quite remember liking, and participating in movements that seemed to emerge from nowhere and disappear just as quickly. The Ashford legacy had transformed democracy itself into a form of emotional theater where the audience believed they were making choices while being carefully guided toward predetermined outcomes. The family had learned to harvest not just individual emotions, but the collective unconscious of entire populations, feeding on the hopes and fears of millions while maintaining the illusion of representative government. The descendants of these families had learned to hide their true nature behind the facades of legitimate business, respectable medicine, and democratic politics. They had evolved beyond the crude rituals of their ancestors, developing sophisticated systems for maintaining their supernatural advantages while avoiding the scrutiny that had driven earlier generations into hiding. Yet the fundamental bargains remained unchanged. Each family still owed debts that accumulated interest with every passing year. The entities they had originally contacted had not forgotten their contracts, and the prices demanded had only grown more complex and demanding with time. The modern world had provided new opportunities for these ancient hungers. Television and internet had created vast networks for emotional manipulation. Global financial systems had made it possible to harvest human suffering on unprecedented scales. Medical technology had opened new possibilities for the transfer and storage of life energy. But the mountains themselves remained the true seat of power, the places where the original bargains had been struck and where the deepest obligations were still fulfilled. On certain nights, when the mist rose from the valleys and the ancient peaks seemed to lean closer together, the descendants would return to their ancestral territories to make their offerings and renew their commitments. These gatherings were no longer the crude ceremonies of their forebears. They had become elaborate productions, with participants arriving in private aircraft and luxury vehicles, their modern wealth and influence serving as testament to the effectiveness of their inherited gifts. But beneath the trappings of contemporary success, the old hungers remained, and the old prices still had to be paid. The entities that had originally granted these families their power had grown stronger as well, fed by generations of offerings and sustained by the expanding network of human suffering that their mortal partners had created. They had learned to operate through corporate structures, political systems, and institutional frameworks, their influence spreading like a virus through the interconnected systems of modern civilization. What had begun as desperate bargains made by struggling families in remote mountain hollows had evolved into something far more ambitious, a systematic restructuring of human society itself, designed to channel the emotional and spiritual energy of entire populations toward the feeding of things that should never have been awakened. The true horror was not in the supernatural elements that lurked in Appalachian caves and abandoned mines, but in how seamlessly these ancient hungers had adapted to modern life. The same forces that had once demanded blood offerings from isolated families now fed on the despair of economic collapse, the fear generated by political instability, and the spiritual emptiness of a society that had lost connection to anything beyond immediate material needs. The descendants of the 6 clans had become administrators of a vast harvesting operation, their success measured not in personal wealth or political power, but in their ability to maintain the flow of human suffering toward entities whose appetites had grown beyond anything their ancestors could have imagined. And in the depths of the mountains, in chambers that existed outside normal space and time, These entities waited with infinite patience, secure in the knowledge that their human servants would continue to expand their operations, generation after generation, until the final harvest could begin. The boundaries between the natural and supernatural, between past and present, between the living and the dead, had not merely blurred. They had been deliberately erased, replaced by a new reality where ancient hungers fed on modern fears, and where the price of prosperity was measured in the currency of human souls. These bloodlines maintained their power through rituals so extreme that even today, certain government facilities hold classified files marked with warnings that the contents pose genuine psychological danger to researchers. The final two clans we're examining today represent the absolute pinnacle of Appalachian occult practice, families whose bargains with otherworldly entities created legacies that continue to influence our world in ways most people cannot begin to comprehend. The Morgans of Shadowfall Ridge developed what they called the Communion of Echoes, a practice that began innocently enough in 1889 when Patriarch Ezra Morgan discovered his gift for hearing the voices of the recently deceased. What started as a blessing that helped grieving families communicate with lost loved ones gradually evolved into something far more sinister, as the Morgan family realized they could harvest more than just messages from beyond the veil. The Morgan homestead sat perched on a ridge where three counties met, a location chosen specifically because local Cherokee legends spoke of it as a place where the boundary between worlds grew thin during certain lunar phases. Ezra initially used his abilities to provide comfort, charging modest fees for seances that genuinely seemed to connect the living with their departed relatives. But as word spread and demand grew, the family discovered that prolonged contact with the dead came with unexpected consequences. The deceased, it seemed, retained not just their memories and personalities, but also their hungers, their unfinished business, their deepest regrets, and most powerful desires. More disturbing still, these spiritual entities could offer knowledge and abilities to the living in exchange for increasingly specific favors. The Morgan family learned that by allowing these spirits to temporarily inhabit their bodies during extended seances, they could gain access to information, skills, and supernatural capabilities that the dead had acquired during their lifetimes. By 1903, the Morgan compound had expanded to include a series of specialized buildings designed to facilitate deeper communion with the spirit world. The central structure, which locals called the echo chamber, was built according to specifications that Ezra claimed came directly from the spirit of a Native American shaman who had died on the ridge centuries earlier. The chamber's walls were constructed from stones taken exclusively from grave sites, mortared together with a mixture that included ash from cremated remains and soil from suicide burial grounds. Inside this chamber, the Morgan family would gather on the night of each new moon to perform what they called the deep calling. Family members would consume a tea brewed from plants that grew only in cemetery soil, combined with water that had been blessed by placing it in contact with the bones of the dead. As the tea took effect, participants would enter a trance state that allowed multiple spirits to inhabit their bodies simultaneously. During these sessions, the possessed Morgan family members would speak in voices not their own, demonstrating knowledge of events that had occurred decades or even centuries before their births. They would write in languages they had never learned, perform complex mathematical calculations beyond their education, and display artistic abilities that seemed to emerge from nowhere. But the most valuable asset gained from these possessions was prophetic knowledge. The spirits, existing outside normal temporal constraints, could provide glimpses of future events that the Morgan family used to amass considerable wealth and influence. The cost of these spiritual bargains became apparent gradually. Each Morgan family member who participated in the deep calling began to age at an accelerated rate, their bodies bearing the cumulative wear of hosting multiple deceased consciousnesses. More disturbing was the gradual erosion of their individual identities. Long-term practitioners would sometimes speak in the voices of their spiritual inhabitants, even when not in trance, their own personalities becoming fragmented and unstable. Children born into the Morgan bloodline displayed unsettling characteristics from birth. They would often speak their first words in voices that sounded like elderly adults, demonstrate knowledge of historical events they could not possibly have learned, and show an uncanny ability to predict deaths in the community days before they occurred. Most disturbing was their tendency to have conversations with invisible companions who seemed to respond with distinct personalities and detailed knowledge of the family's history. The Morgan practices reached their peak during the Great Depression when desperate families from across the region sought their services. The family had by then developed a complex hierarchy of spiritual contacts with different deceased entities specializing in various forms of assistance. Some spirits provided financial guidance, others offered healing knowledge, and a select few could allegedly influence the actions of living people at a distance. But the most powerful spirits demanded the highest prices. The Morgan family learned that certain ancient entities, beings that had never been human, could be contacted through their network of deceased intermediaries. These entities offered abilities that transcended normal supernatural gifts, including the power to manipulate time itself, to alter memories in living people, and to influence weather patterns across entire regions. The price for such power was always the same: permanent spiritual possession of a Morgan family member. By 1947, only 3 members of the original Morgan bloodline remained unpossessed. The family compound had become a place where the boundary between life and death had effectively dissolved. Visitors reported seeing deceased Morgan family members walking the grounds alongside the living, their forms translucent but clearly visible and interactive. The echo chamber itself had become a permanent gateway, with spirits moving freely between the world of the dead and the realm of the living. The end came suddenly in the winter of 1948, when the youngest Morgan, a girl named Sarah who had resisted possession longer than any previous family member, finally succumbed to the pressure of hosting what witnesses described as dozens of spirits simultaneously. Her body, unable to contain such spiritual energy, simply dissolved into mist during a particularly intense seance, taking with her the accumulated spiritual knowledge of 5 generations of Morgan practitioners. The compound was found empty the next morning, though investigators reported that the echo chamber continued to emit sounds of voices speaking in languages that linguistic experts could not identify. The building was sealed by federal authorities and remains off limits to this day, though locals report that on certain nights, lights can still be seen moving through the windows, and the sound of multiple voices engaged in conversation drifts across the ridge. The final clan in our examination represents perhaps the most successful integration of supernatural power with modern influence. The Blackwood family, descendants of the original Massachusetts settlers we discussed earlier, evolved their practices over generations to create what can only be described as a shadow government operating within legitimate political and economic structures throughout the southeastern United States. Unlike other families who remained isolated in mountain communities, the Blackwoods recognized early that true power in the modern world required integration with established institutions. Beginning in the 1920s, they systematically placed family members in positions of influence within banks, newspapers, law enforcement agencies, and political organizations across 6 states. Their supernatural abilities, refined through generations of blood ritual and entity worship, gave them unprecedented advantages in manipulating public opinion and controlling information flow. The Blackwood approach differed fundamentally from other families in that they focused not on individual power but on collective influence. Their rituals were designed to create a shared consciousness among family members, allowing them to coordinate activities across vast distances and multiple institutions with uncanny precision. This hive mind effect was achieved through monthly gatherings where family members would participate in what they called the binding, a ceremony that involved the ritualistic sharing of blood, memories, and spiritual energy. During these binding ceremonies, held in underground chambers constructed beneath seemingly ordinary Blackwood properties, family members would arrange themselves in concentric circles around a central altar carved from a single piece of obsidian. The altar's surface was inscribed with symbols that predated any known written language, markings that family historians claimed had been revealed to their ancestors by the entities they served. Each participant would make precise cuts on their palms, allowing their blood to flow into channels carved into the altar's surface. As the blood mixed and began to glow with an unnatural luminescence, family members would enter a shared trance state during which their individual consciousnesses would merge temporarily into a collective awareness. In this state, they could share memories, coordinate future actions, and receive guidance from the otherworldly entities that had formed pacts with their bloodline generations earlier. The binding also allowed the family to pool their supernatural abilities, creating effects far beyond what any individual member could achieve alone. The Blackwood Network's influence became most apparent during major historical events of the 20th century. Financial records suggest they possessed foreknowledge of stock market crashes, enabling them to profit enormously from economic disasters that devastated other families. Political documents indicate their involvement in campaign financing and media manipulation that influenced election outcomes in ways that traditional political science cannot fully explain. Most disturbing are the correlations between Blackwood family gatherings and subsequent natural disasters, suggesting their rituals may have developed the ability to influence geological and meteorological events. By the 1970s, the Blackwood Network had evolved into something resembling a modern corporation, with family members holding executive positions in major energy companies, media conglomerates, and financial institutions. Their supernatural abilities had been refined to focus on information gathering and psychological manipulation, allowing them to predict market trends, influence public opinion, and eliminate business competitors through methods that left no traceable evidence. The family's practices had also evolved to incorporate modern technology. Their binding ceremonies now included electronic components that amplified and recorded the shared consciousness experiences, creating a permanent repository of collective knowledge that could be accessed by future generations. They developed techniques for implanting subliminal messages in broadcast media that could influence the thoughts and behaviors of millions of viewers simultaneously. Most significantly, the Blackwood network had learned to reproduce their supernatural abilities artificially. Through a combination of genetic manipulation, pharmaceutical enhancement, and technological augmentation, they could grant limited versions of their powers to non-family members who served their interests. This created a vast network of enhanced individuals occupying key positions throughout society, all linked through artificial versions of the family's supernatural communication abilities. The current status of the Blackwood network remains classified at the highest levels of government, though evidence suggests their influence has only grown with the advent of digital communication and global financial systems. Their ability to manipulate information flow has evolved to include control over internet algorithms, social media platforms, and digital financial networks. Some researchers believe they may have achieved their ultimate goal, creating a technological system that replicates and amplifies their supernatural abilities on a global scale. The legacy of these 6 Appalachian bloodlines extends far beyond their mountain origins. Their practices, refined over generations of desperate bargains with otherworldly entities, created templates for supernatural power that continue to influence our world in ways most people never recognize. The entities they contacted, the portals they opened, and the fundamental alterations they made to reality itself persist, waiting for new generations to discover and exploit the pathways they carved between worlds. In the deepest archives of certain government facilities, researchers continue to study artifacts and documents recovered from these family compounds, trying to understand the true scope of what was unleashed in those isolated mountain valleys. The work proceeds slowly, carefully, with strict protocols designed to prevent the accidental reactivation of powers that were never meant to exist in our world. Because the real horror of these Appalachian bloodlines isn't just what they did to themselves and their communities, but what they may have done to the fundamental fabric of reality itself, changes that ripple outward through time and space, affecting lives and events in ways we are only beginning to comprehend. These 6 clans represent more than just family legends passed down through generations of mountain folk. They illustrate how desperation in the remote Appalachian hollows could drive people to make bargains that would echo through their bloodlines for decades to come. While skeptics might dismiss these accounts as folklore, the documented evidence tells a different story. The Holey mine records, the Thornton Company's impossible success, the Whitaker musical legacy, and the mysterious disappearances connected to each family paint a picture of something far more complex than simple mountain superstition.